Hi, everyone. My name is Erin Canan, and I'm the Vice President for Civic Engagement at Bard College. And I'm also part of the Open Society University Network Civic Engagement team, which has collaborated with the Open Society University Disability Justice Working Group to launch this inaugural talk and panel series. And we are very excited to be starting this initiative. We are trying to build a program on disability justice to foster an inclusive environment at OSUN institutions. And the inaugural lecture delivered today by Professor Anna Lawson is going to also be in addition to a number of panel series that we're entitling Inclusive Education Opportunities and Challenges. And part of what we're trying to do is establish three different, work on three different action items. The first is to foster a disability inclusive institutional environment and institutional policies informed by the principles of equity, diversity, inclusion, improve institutional practices to better serve OSUN students, faculty, and staff, and to establish OSUN's credibility in addressing disability justice, while also expanding educational curricular offerings with a focus on disability and human rights studies, and make the teaching and learning spaces accessible and inclusive for students with disabilities. Today, our lecture will be moderated by Elena Kim. Elena is a visiting associate professor of psychology on an OSUN faculty exchange. So right now she's in Bard College in New York, but is normally at the American University of Central Asia. Elena is an educator and activist for knowledge, empowerment, and social justice. She has served as the chair of the Department of Psychology at American University of Central Asia, and is the co-chair and co-founder of the Center for Critical Gender Studies and the head of the Division of Social Studies. Her areas of research include gender studies, development and institutional ethnography, and violence. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Elena, who's going to lead us through the discussion today.
Thank you, Erin, and welcome everybody to the inaugural lecture of the OSUN Disability Justice Working Group. I can't stress enough how fortunate we all feel for having Professor Anna Lawson with us today as our first speaker. And it's my great privilege to introduce her. So Anna is a professor of law at Leeds University with the areas of expertise which range from disability rights and law to inclusive public spaces, to equality, accessibility, and inclusion. And we know that Anna's special research interest is in the opportunities for change created by the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in accessing justice, and also in the disabling and enabling potential of law. Besides that, Anna holds membership, trustee, and advisory positions in a range of local, national, and international disabled peoples and human rights organizations. Anna is well known, internationally recognized for her activism and research. And of course, we could not find a better person to mark the launch of the OSUN program on disability, which, as Erin said very nicely, ultimately aims at creating the most inclusive, the most diverse, and the most justice-oriented environments within OSUN institutions for everybody, for students, for faculty, and for staff. So what we are about to do is we're about to learn from Anna about a macro level overview of the international legal and human rights frameworks of disability justice. Importantly, we will also learn about how what is called today the social model of disability has been reframed locally by the people with disabilities themselves. Anna, we are so grateful that you accepted our invitation to be our inaugural speaker. And without any further ado, I am happy to give the floor to you. Anna, I think your mic is off. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah,
Oh,
we
that's
hear
not
you.
a good start. So thank you so much, Elena, for those very kind words. And thank you all for being here. It really is such a huge honor and privilege to be asked to deliver this inaugural lecture for this really innovative, exciting, and an important venture that you have. So I've called my talk, sorry, I didn't send you a title in advance, but I've called it for myself, Disability, Justice and the Academy. And I'm going to use my time to reflect a little about each of those ideas and the connections between them. But I want to stress at this stage that I'm using them very broadly. I realize that some of you are from organizations other than universities, but hope that this talk will be just as relevant to you as to those of you who are in universities. So first of all then, disability. And each of these three terms or concepts I could talk about for a very long time, as I'm sure you realize, but I'm going to try and be disciplined. So disability. I'm just going to start with some reflections on this term. And I've been encouraged by the organisers to draw on my own personal experience. So please indulge me while I do just that. So a lot happened for me at the age of 7. I started losing my sight at that age, and I'll come back to that later. I also stopped eating meat. That was because I had a pet lamb, and whilst eating lamb for lunch one Sunday, I realised where meat came from, and I couldn't physically eat it anymore after that. At that time, and for some time afterwards, I didn't know anyone else who didn't eat meat. It certainly wasn't the done thing in my family, all of whom were very worried about me. But I can still remember the delight I felt when, some 2 years later, when I was in school, and I came across the word vegetarian. It made me realise that I wasn't on my own, and there must be other people like me out there. That was an early lesson for me on how important language can be and how it can generate a sense of belonging and empowerment. In the disability context too, as Elena has mentioned, I think, language is hugely powerful. This was recognised last year by the Supreme Court of India in a case which I've just written a blog about actually, and I'm happy to send on a link. Basically, it was called Kumar, and it's a fascinating case for many reasons. But one of the really interesting things about it was that the Supreme Court there criticised the earlier judges for their use of language about disability. In particular, they criticised the tribunal judge for saying that the disabled person in question suffered from their disability. So it was the use of the word suffering in connection with disability that was criticised. And the Supreme Court called on people in the justice system to reflect carefully on their discourse around disability and called on them to commit to using language which disabled people would find empowering and inclusive, and to avoid language which would set disabled people apart from others. And they drew on the language of Justice Ruth Ginsburg here to say that setting apart could either be by putting them on a pedestal or by putting them in a cage. So as somebody who talks and writes about disability, that too is my goal with language, to use language which the disabled people I'm referring to will find enabling rather than disabling, empowering rather than stigmatizing. But what that language actually is will vary across context and place and time. In relation to time, the implications and connotations of language around disability change. And this is partly because disability is such a stigmatized phenomenon. So terms that once were not generally regarded as stigmatizing may become so. I suspect we can all think of disability-related words which once referred to particular types of medical condition, which are now commonly used as insults. Words such as special can also be problematic because, although they sound superficially positive, they can quickly feel like euphemisms for different and strange. As the Indian Supreme Court recognized, being isolated on a pedestal isn't necessarily much better than being isolated in a cage. In relation to place, language is sometimes used differently. Disability-related language is sometimes used differently by disability activists in different parts of the world, despite the fact that they share values and commitments. The obvious example of this is the prevalence of the term disabled people in the UK and people with disabilities in the United States. Just to reflect a little bit on those two terms, the reason for the term people with disabilities is perhaps a little bit more self-evident than the reason for disabled people. It positions the person before the disability and does so very deliberately. It's person first language. And by doing that, it respects and recognizes the personhood of the individual in question. The term disabled people is used because of a commitment to the social model of disability. And you'll notice that that's the term I've been using because it's my default term. And I'm hoping that if I explain why I'm using it, you'll understand why. So it's used because of a commitment to the social model of disability. And this model is, in essence, a political repurposing of the term disability by disability activists, which originally happened in the 1970s, in 1976, with the Union of Physically Impaired Against Segregation. So they used the term disability. They set out a manifesto in which they said that they were going to be using the term disability to refer not to the functional limitation of individuals, like limitation in sight or hearing or mobility or whatever, so not to refer to that, but to refer instead to the exclusion and oppression which people with impairments experience. So they use the term impairment to refer to that functional limitation, and the term disability to refer to the social exclusion and disadvantage and oppression which people with impairments experience. And they experience that when societies are designed on ableist assumptions and expectations that people can see, walk, or hear, or whatever, that people have certain levels of functional capacities, and fail to tackle stigmatizing or disabling attitudes and practices. So if one understands disability in that way to mean social oppression, in effect to be a synonym of social oppression, it doesn't really make sense to say person with disability, but it does make sense to refer to a person being disabled because they're being disabled by external forces. So that's just a little bit of explanation of the terminology and the idea of the social model, I guess. So discovering this alternative meaning of the word disability, which I did relatively late, because becoming disabled was a gradual process for me, and entering into disability politics was therefore also a bit of a slow process. But discovering this alternative meaning of the term disability was, for me, a bit like discovering the term vegetarian, but better. It helped me realize that exclusion wasn't inevitable just because I was becoming blind, and that I could work with other people who had visual and other types of impairment to shape society differently. Liz Crow, who I know I quote in the article, which was on the reading as well, but I do love this quote. She puts this feeling so well. She says, discovering this way of thinking about my experiences was the proverbial raft in stormy seas. It gave me an understanding of my life, shared with thousands, even millions of other people around the world, and I clung to it. It has been my mainstay, as it has been for the wider disabled people's movement. So this idea of what, giving a label, using the word disability to refer to essentially social exclusion, social oppression, and recognizing that that oppression is externally created, creates a sense of empowerment in that there's a sense that you can actually, there's something to tackle, to challenge. It's not just all about looking for a cure. You can influence the way society is. And it also creates a sense of togetherness with other people who experience similar types of oppression, even if they have different types of impairment. So it allows people with different types of impairment to really come together and feel that sense of belonging and sense of collective endeavour. So before moving away from disability and the language we choose to use around it, it's worth noting that everybody committed to this sort of field will have personal or default preferences, and they'll all have good reasons for those, which need to be respected. Often it's helpful to articulate what they are if you're writing something, but yeah, I think there's different terminology with different reasons behind it, some of which, many of those reasons will come from the same place, the same value base. I know there is worry about language, and I think just if there is any doubt about what language to use or uncertainty about it, it's always worth remembering that there's no one single right way, and that attentiveness to the language used by relevant disabled people's organisations is probably a really good guide. So that's all I'm going to say about disability for now. It may come up again in the discussion. But moving on to justice. So I'm a lawyer and I'm an academic. So justice, particularly in the disability context, is something really I could talk about for days, not just hours. But you'll be relieved to hear I'm going to try to restrain myself and promise not to get too technical or theoretical. What I want to highlight is the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, because I think that's the best place to look to for guidance as to what disability justice means. This is as much because of how it was written as because of what it says, although what it says is influenced by how it was written. The CRPD, as I'll call it from now, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, as many of you will know, is a human rights treaty adopted by the UN General Assembly in 2006. It's now been ratified or committed to by most governments around the world. So it therefore has the added value of giving us a shared global reference point. So what's significant about the way it was written, the way it was drafted? The most significant thing about this is the unprecedented involvement of civil society, and more particularly organisations representing the people whom the treaty was designed to benefit in the drafting process. So obviously it was disabled people's organisations that were involved. So that drafting process began in the usual way, with the drafting being done primarily by government representatives. But pretty quickly, they realised that they wouldn't be able to really write an effective treaty dealing with disability rights unless they had additional input from people who were much more familiar with the concerns and issues involved, i.e. disabled people and their organisations. So they opened up the process to disabled people's organisations. So it was that opening up was taken, that opportunity to get involved was taken up very enthusiastically by disabled people's organisations around the world. At the last of the drafting sessions in August 2006, which I was lucky enough to attend as part of the World Blind Union delegation, there were about 600 representatives from disabled people's organisations, so a huge number. Although we didn't have voting rights, we were able to exercise considerable influence collectively over the negotiating process, partly due to the skillful chairing of the chair. So if there was a difficult issue, he would suspend the formal discussions and allow mingling between civil society and government representatives. And there were also a series of events put on by disabled people's organisations to raise awareness and understanding of particular issues of concern. So the CRPD is very much shaped by disabled people's organisations. And it's therefore informed by the key struggles and priorities that have affected the history of the disabled people's movement. What does it say? I'm not going to try and convey all of that in this short lecture, but we'll pull out 4 of the provisions of the CRPD in particular, which I think it's useful for you to have in mind at this macro level. First, the aim of the CRPD is set out in Article 1, the first of the main provisions of the treaty. This makes it clear that the aim of the CRPD is to ensure that existing human rights are enjoyed on an equal basis by disabled people. So its aim, and actually the mandate given to the drafters of the treaty, wasn't to create new rights. It was simply to ensure that existing rights, which are supposed to be universal and therefore to apply to everybody, are made equally available to disabled people as to non-disabled people. Its ambition was therefore to tackle a serious implementation gap in human rights treaties concerning disabled people, of which there was growing evidence by the time that the CRPD was drafted. So although the CRPD's aim isn't to create new rights, the CRPD unquestionably changed and enriched the human rights system in ways that have prompted ongoing debates about whether in reality it did actually create new rights. Frederick Maygray's work has been particularly thought-provoking and influential on this. So the CRPD sets out things like a right to accessibility, a right to live independently and be included in the community, a right to personal mobility, and a right to habilitation and rehabilitation. Those are rights which have never previously been articulated in a UN human rights treaty. Arguably, and this is the justification that's used, these provisions draw out explicitly aspects of previously established rights which never previously needed to be articulated so clearly. But it's because we're dealing with, when you look at human rights through a disability lens, you need to pull out some of the preconditions, the assumptions about what's in place in order to make rights meaningful for disabled people. So accessibility isn't something that normally needs to be highlighted quite so clearly. The right to choose to live in the community on the same basis as others isn't something that normally needs to be said. It goes without unspoken. The right to habilitation and rehabilitation is perhaps implicit within health provision, but it's such an important issue for disabled people that it needs to be pulled out more explicitly. So that's the rationale, that's the argument for them being already there, just articulated in a different way. So that's the argument that they're not new rights. But as you can imagine, and as I'm sure a lot of you will be aware, a lot of these debates go on about whether in reality, this is such a substantial change as to amount to a new right in practice. So the second provision I want to draw your attention to is one that's unusual in a human rights treaty. It's an article called General Principles. This provision essentially sets out the underpinning values of the treaty, and it's Article 3. So examples of those principles in Article 3 are respect for inherent dignity and individual autonomy, including the freedom to make one's own choices, accessibility, non-discrimination and equality of opportunity both feature. Equality between men and women also features. So does full and effective participation and inclusion in society. And so does, and this is an interesting one, respect for difference and acceptance of persons with disabilities as part of humanity. I've paraphrased slightly. So those are essentially the underpinning value system of the CRPD, and that therefore needs to be remembered and understood and borne in mind whenever you look at any of the other substantive rights set out in the treaty. Those values help interpret the treaty. And so too do a number of rights set out early on in the treaty, which are cross-cutting in effect. Well, all human rights are intersecting and overlapping, but these particular ones, I think, have a particular claim to be cross-cutting. And those include the right to accessibility in Article 9 of the treaty, and the right to be free from discrimination in Article 5. And there are innovations although the right to be free from non-discrimination is one of the oldest of rights, the CRPD introduces new dimensions of it. So it makes it clear that a failure to provide reasonable accommodation will constitute discrimination, for instance. And that's the first time that's been done in a UN human rights treaty. The third provision I want to draw your attention to is Article 24. And this is the right to inclusive education. Paragraph 1 of this recognises that disabled people have a right to education without discrimination and requires states to ensure that the education system is inclusive at all levels, so implying tertiary education levels as well as primary and secondary. And that's made clear in paragraph 5 of Article 24, which is specifically about tertiary education, vocational training, adult education, and lifelong learning. That paragraph specifies that disabled people must have access to these on an equal basis to others, and that it must be free from discrimination, which includes the provision of reasonable accommodation. So that's, I think Article 24 is particularly relevant, obviously, to your network and the work that you're doing. And obviously what you're doing builds very much on the same sentiments as and the same requirements which are set out there in Article 24. Fourth, and finally on the CRPD, Article 4.3 of the CRPD. It requires states to closely consult and actively involve disabled people and through their representative organisations in the development and implementations of policies and practices relating to them. So while this duty, along with all the duties in human rights treaties, apply to governments, they have relevance and can be useful to other types of organisation. And many of the duties on governments actually ripple out and will affect those organisations anyway. There are obligations on governments to ensure that other organisations do certain things. But going beyond that, Article 4.3 is one that is useful to bear in mind for all organisations committed to disability justice and disability inclusion. The commitment to actively involving, closely consulting disabled people and their representative organisations on the rollout of their policies and practices. And I think there are then conversations with them maybe about how those conversations are best had, what processes are best to be used to involve them. Because I know a lot of disabled people's organisations in the UK and probably around the world are having a certain amount of consultation fatigue at the moment, particularly because a lot of consultation isn't funded, and a lot of disabled people's organisations are very poorly resourced. So, giving time for a lot of consultation to other people can be quite a drain on the operation of those organisations. So moving on to the third dimension, the third element of the talk, academia. Bringing disability justice into universities and other places of tertiary education and embedding it there is one of the aims of your network. So I know you all have already done a huge amount of thinking about this important topic, as indeed have I, over the 30 years that I've worked in the university sector. And before that, obviously, when I was a student in it. Looking back on my own time, things have certainly improved. When I started out as a student, it was very difficult for blind students to access printed material. It still isn't as easy as it should be, but it was so much more difficult then. I actually chose my undergraduate degree in Leeds because of Leeds stood out as offering a transcription service for blind and partially sighted students, whereby it would put printed material onto audio tape. But then I did a postgraduate degree elsewhere where there wasn't such a service. And that coincided with my sister, who's also blind, with her starting her undergraduate degree. And when we contacted the main provider of taping services, the National Organisation for Blind People, they told us that they could provide one audio book for us by the beginning of term between us, even though we were doing different courses. And so clearly that wasn't going to work. And my wonderful mother wasn't going to have our our hopes crushed by that. So she stepped in and mobilised the family and the small village in Wales where we lived.
Is she frozen or is it me?
Oh, I am experiencing the same. So I think it's on the part of Anna.
Many different people and parts of a university to ensure that their experience will be inclusive and that they'll have the same chances to succeed and to be judged on their academic ability as their non-disabled counterparts. For this to happen, disability awareness needs to be mainstreamed across institutions so that everybody who's interacting with disabled students and staff is aware of, reasonable practices around reasonable accommodation or reasonable adjustments, as we would call them. So it has some basic disability awareness and knows where to go if they need additional advice or support. And there need to be strong mechanisms for providing that support to students and staff and advice. So strong mechanisms for providing support to disabled staff and students, but also for providing advice to staff who are working alongside or with other disabled staff and students. These mechanisms, this support, do involve some investment of resource. However, there are 4 points I'd like to make about this, because I know it's often a point of concern for any organisation, the amount of money that will need to be spent. First, I found that some of the most difficult adjustments to get agreed, are ones that don't actually involve any resource at all. They involve ensuring that regulations, which have been introduced to create like blanket rules, simple solutions, to ensure that they're not applied in a strict or absolute manner without reflecting on whether there's a disability-related reason for being flexible in a particular case. And actually, I found that, I think COVID has made that particularly, it's made it even more difficult than it used to be. In some cases, I've found recently, we seem to be falling back because our systems have been thrown into a certain degree of stress because of the COVID situation. There's a tendency to fall back on blanket rules and just reminding everyone that actually there needs to be flexibility for disability related reasons is really, really important, but sometimes can be difficult. But that doesn't involve any cost, and it's still hugely important. So cost isn't the problem there. It's attitude. Second, budgets are sometimes presented as if disability related costs are separate add-ons and therefore in some way optional. If they're integrated into the cost of the core activity instead, it's much more difficult to argue that, or to be tempted to engage in discussions of them as being optional or negotiable. Third, universities, like many other large organisations, are often composed of lots of smaller departments, which all have their own separate budgets. Often, actually, legal liability doesn't follow through to the separate departments. It falls on the institution as a whole. And I think it's really important to remember that when disability budgets are being considered, and to try and centralise the pots rather than making each individual department have to budget in the disability related costs for disabled staff and disabled students in case, because they're because their budgets tend to be smaller than the centralized pot, there are temptations, perverse disincentives created against taking on disabled students or disabled staff. So centralized budgets as much as possible. And fourth, it's so critically important to take an anticipatory approach and to embed accessibility into purchasing and procurement systems. It's one of the things that seems to be particularly challenging in university sectors, though, perhaps because the people involved in making those decisions often don't have disability-related expertise. So decisions about, what software systems we're going to be using, just what new technologies we're adopting, and they're changing all the time. So just making sure that accessibility is really firmly embedded at that stage of purchasing and procurement. In terms of teaching content, one of the parts of my career I found most fulfilling is developing disability-related modules at master's level and undergraduate level. In the past few years, it's become easier for us to include students from other disciplines in our modules and to teach with and alongside colleagues from other schools. Issues of disability justice really do lend themselves so well to interdisciplinary collaboration of this kind. And it can just make classes are so much more stimulating. The students learn so much from each other when they're from different backgrounds and bringing different perspectives and types of expertise to the table. Developing disability-specific modules can take time. It did for me. But before then and alongside those initiatives, there's tremendous scope and indeed a compelling need to bring critical disability or disability justice perspectives into modules and courses on a whole range of different subjects. It's not only academic staff who can do this. Students too can introduce relevant questions and debates from their own experience, from looking at the work of disabled people's organisations, or from readings that they've come across that aren't necessarily on the set reading lists. Your commitment as a network to strengthening connections between civil society and universities is hugely important and valuable. And there's so much rich potential for this in the disability justice sphere. Over the years, we in Leeds have explored a number of ways of increasing connections between students and disabled people's organisations, as well as through research. It's an ongoing venture for us, as I'm sure it is and will be for you. I know that there's so much that we can all learn from each other, and ready-made collaborations such as those in your network open up many options and opportunities. So that brings me to the end of my talk today. I realized this was a big subject, perhaps 3 subjects, and in many ways too big to be covered in one lecture. I've only scratched the surface, but it's your subject, the subject of this new series. And so there'll be many opportunities for you to delve into aspects of it in much more depth than is possible today. I can't tell you how delighted I am that you are starting this series and taking up this important initiative. And I can't tell you how honoured I am to be part of it at the beginning. So good luck to all of you. Thank you for involving me in it at this stage, and huge congratulations for getting it going. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Indeed, congratulations to us all for being your generosity and educating us about the developments, the recent developments that have been happening, and also the history. And thank you for enlightening us about the issues related to language and empowerment and connections between discourses. That was a lot of material to process, and I'm sure for, for most of us, we will take these insights, as inspiration to, as you said, study more and be interested more and read more. So thank you for inciting this interest in all of us. I would like to open the floor for questions and answers. We have about 20 minutes for this session. And we have a chat box here, which is called Q&A option. So I'd like to invite the attendees, colleagues, students to write your questions in that section. Meanwhile, there was a little preparatory work for your lecture, and students who are taking a collaborative network civic engagement course prepared a number of questions that they were interested in. Some of the questions were related to the role of the civil society, human rights, the kind of the standardized and objective and also objectifying language in the international documents. So many of these issues have been covered by what we've just heard from you, Anna. But there is something that I think I'd like to emphasize. I'd like to start with a question by a student whose name is Natalisa. And she's quoting Thomas Shakespeare in his speech, where he says, "You may be physically handicapped, but you should not limit yourself to that. We can bring our own touch to the community and participate in its well-being. So it's time to change our perception and people with disability." And this is where she says her question comes from. What would be the most effective ways? And we've been talking about mainstreaming, mainstreaming disability issues into all levels of policy and practices. So in relation to what Natalisa is asking, and many other students kind of joined that question. And this is about what would be good lessons learned from the successful implementation and enforcement of the UN Convention, but also the role of the state in relation to the implementation. Yes, that, and to complicate it even more, there are questions about the budgets, not only at the level of the university, but at the state level. Some students are raising the concern that if there is no budget, there is probably not going to be sustained and sustainable policy level change. Yes, so that's the kind of a compound question that I am relaying to you.
Thank you very much. Lovely. Okay, yes, gosh, there's lots of meaty material in there, if I can use that phrase. So I think I'm going to start answering it at a micro level, just thinking about that quote from Tom Shakespeare that Natalisa pointed out. So that's very much thinking about the individual and what the individual can do to promote change. And it's rather a lovely quote, as many of Tom's quotes are actually, because I think so you may have a disability, but that doesn't need to constrain who you are as a person. So if you're a disabled person, like I am, you will have things that you enjoy, things that you want to do. So it
seems we're having another glitch, but let's hope it's gonna disappear just as the first one did.
go to friends. Oh, have we lost it? Hello?
You are back now, Anna.
Oh,
We're
sorry,
back. But we did lose you for maybe a minute. So we didn't hear
okay.
what you were saying in the last minute. I'm sorry.
Okay.
That'd be too cruel of me to ask you to.
No, not at all. So I was just going to give an example of, I think just to illustrate the point of doing what you would like to do and what you enjoy doing as a person and challenging the obstacles as they come along. So we had a student who was a wheelchair user a few years ago, and she wanted to go to a nightclub in the city centre with her friends, her student friends. When they got there, they found that there was a flight of steps and no alternative access. So she actually wasn't going to make a fuss about it because she was quite used to these things, but her friends were so shocked and horrified by this illustration of exclusion that they became very active campaigners alongside her for nightclubs to be made more accessible. And that resulted in that particular nightclub changing its policy and introducing an alternative way in so that wheelchair users could get in too. So I think in some ways, you know, at an individual level, it's just about living your life and trying to do what you want to do, what you're interested in, and tackle, you know, trying to make change, even if those changes don't seem very big along the way. But obviously, if you're committed to change and you want to be an activist, which not all of us do, not everybody does, then joining with others in a collective endeavour is really important. So that can happen in various ways, but disabled people's organisations are the obvious route. Yes, so that's at the micro level of what individual can do. Then thinking about the state, and I might be in danger of making the question more complicated than it should be.
I think we might have lost you again, Anna, if you can hear us.
Oh, have I lost? Did I lose you again?
Yes, and
Oh,
when you
dear.
just started answering question, you kindly warned us that the answer would be complicated, and then and then at this particular moment, yes,
I went. Oh gosh, I'm so sorry. I don't know what's happening to it. Yeah. So at the state level, the fact that states have ratified the CRPD, if your government has ratified the CRPD, that can be a really powerful lever for disabled people's organisations to use in their campaigning. So even if you find that your government isn't implementing the treaty with the same energy and resource and effort that you would like, highlighting that to the UN through shadow reports can be really useful because it creates a level of political embarrassment for governments at the international level, which they wouldn't otherwise have to deal with. So although, you know, you can't go, well, in the UK, you can't go to court and enforce the CRPD. We can use it as leverage in campaigning. In some other countries, actually, the law is different and you can use international treaties in your domestic court system. So that's a lot easier, but in a lot of other countries like the UK, we can't do that. So it's more using it for political leverage. But yeah, certainly in South American countries, it's much easier to enforce international human rights treaties directly by going to court and bringing a case in your own country. I don't know whether that covers covers the points that were asked. Please do ask again if there are points that I missed.
Thank you, Anna. That was, of course, a very multi-layered, multifaceted, complex
I
question.
didn't address the budget issue.
Maybe we could go to a different question. We have people asking questions in the chat box. Maybe we could slowly move to these questions, and maybe we'll return to the budget later. Yeah. So I'd like to read then a question from Kate Adams. She is saying, thank you so much for such inspiring and thought-provoking talk. Lots to take away and think about. I wanted to ask about the possible generative resources of disability. I'm not sure that is phrased well, but how can difference, physical and intellectual, teach everyone about potential new ways to look and understand the world? Have you researched or written about this? It's a good one.
That's a really interesting idea and a really interesting question. And I actually haven't done research into that, but as such, but was involved in writing a proposal for funding to fund research onto that, but we sadly missed out. Just yeah, we were pipped to it. But I think there's a huge amount of learning that comes from disability. It's partly about flex. So I think it operates at lots of different levels. So disabled people can learn a lot from each other about ways of solutions for dealing with some of the challenges that we all experience. But as well as that, I think it does need a good research project, this actually, because there are ways that mainstream society has, but could benefit even more from some of the practices, the ideas that have been developed in the disability context, because of the resourcefulness actually that often is applied in the lives of disabled people to overcome challenges that other people don't have to deal with. Yeah, I think the generative potential is a beautiful way of putting it. Yeah. I think in robotics, there's a lot that's going on in this space at the moment. There's quite a lot of investment around the world into how robotics can work to facilitate disabled people to do certain things. I wish there was still more resource and energy and generative potential put into technical solutions, particularly around accessibility and technology. But yeah, there's a lot. So there's a lot, I think, that starts off as being disability specific, but then there are often advanced, potentials that are discovered that could roll out to society more widely. I think just at a very simple human level, I started going on some activity holidays for visually impaired people because I wanted to go skiing, and my friends who weren't disabled were going on ski holidays from school, which my school, which was a special school, wasn't doing. And then I found out about these holidays where you could go skiing. So I thought, yes, I'm going to do that, rather than going with friends and feeling like I was going to be a bit of a burden on them or spoiling their, changing their holiday. So I learned to ski through going on those holidays and various other things as well. But they were often led by mainstream holiday providers. So they would, it would be in connection with a mainstream holiday provider like skiing or climbing or whatever it was. And they always commented on the fact that the degree of friendship, instant connections and human bonding in our holidays, where it was half and half disabled and non-disabled people, were so it happened so much quicker and at a so much stronger level, even though we were all strangers when we started, than it did on any of their standard holidays. So I think often there's a degree of trust and a degree of communication that has to happen because of disability, that doesn't happen in other contexts. And that itself can be hugely valuable.
Thank you for your response. And I hope, Kate, that your question was answered. I'd like to move on to the second one by Campbell Kurlander. She says, first, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us and share your wisdom. I heard you mention that you have a blog, and I know that the internet, especially blogs, are a platform that is important for the disability community. What types of media do you think are most accessible? And how do you think academia can change their value system and the types of works that are being taught to create a more inclusive environment? So that's her question. But I would like to ask, abusing my role of a moderator, if you could also, in answering this question, talk a little bit about the new journal that you launched, the International Journal of Disability and Social Justice. I know you have had your first issue already. Yeah.
Thank you, Elena. Yes, thank you. Gosh, these are such good questions. So yeah, a blog. So that was actually a guest blog. I'm writing for the Oxford Human Rights Hub. We do have one in the Centre for Disability Studies, but we used to. I think it's slightly collapsed because not many people have been writing for it. But I think blogs are very useful as a way of connecting, making ideas accessible, and that's really important in terms of connecting academia with civil society and vice versa. So academia needs to be really informed by civil society about what's important and useful to research in for the priorities of disabled people's organisations, but also the other way around, so that academia needs to communicate clearly the research findings in ways that can be useful to and usable by civil society and disabled people's organisations. So there's that level of communication and accessibility. And actually, in this new journal that we've got, the International Journal of Disability and Social Justice, we've tried to think about accessibility at many levels. So that's one of the levels. So alongside the full articles, we're also going to be having short, plain English summaries of the content of the article to try and really get the ideas communicated to a wider audience, on a busier audience. Then there's the type of accessibility that I think those of us who are very familiar with disability issues are more familiar with, which is actually being able to access something. So for me, I mentioned reading was a particular issue, reading printed material. Reading electronic material can also be more difficult than it should be. So PDF files are still often very difficult for people with screen readers, particularly if they're longer pieces of work or if they have footnotes or tables. And they can also be difficult for people who don't have such good broadband, such good Wi-Fi. So again, for this journal, we're going to be having the articles in HTML or XML as well as PDF. The other thing I think I'm going to mention here, which I found immensely frustrating, is things like ebooks, which should be, you think, oh, fantastic, because in a sense, I've been making in order to read printed books, I've been having them scanned, so made into ebooks for a very long time. But now that a lot of libraries have ebooks, they're still not very accessible to visually impaired people. So there's still a lot of work that has to be done to make books which are in inaccessible electronic format into a format another electronic format that can be easily used by people who are using screen readers. And another frustration that's I think really important in academia is that we keep reinventing the wheel. So in lots of different institutions, lots of different individual offices, people are scanning the same materials to make them readable, to put them into a format that's readable and accessible for them. There are some resources for sharing those accessible libraries of electronic materials, but all too often they're limited, and yeah, there's publishers still have quite a lot of weight in restricting who can have access to them. So the Marrakesh Treaty has helped, but there's still a lot more work that needs to be done around, really clearly labeling and navigating materials that have already been made accessible and making them shareable with others. Yeah, so thank you for that really excellent question that's so very dear to my heart.
Oh, thank you, Anna. We have a little time for the last question, and it's a question about global power relations. So I'm going to read it out. This is by Ehsan Achaksai. I hope I'm pronouncing it well. So they say the disability convention piece of writing is too important, as the author emphasized on disability rights are more like human rights. Looking through the human rights prism, why the world is pretending to make reasonable adjustments for the disabled sapiens. Wars are creating more catastrophe, leaving more humans disabled. Why always do the powerful and so-called advanced countries are spending more on mass destruction weapons rather than helping the weaker states? Oh, that's a big question, yes.
I think I suspect that's more of a comment than a question, and I share your puzzlement. I think at the moment it's particularly important to be mindful of the way that wars create disablement, and also how already disabled people fare in wartime. It's a human catastrophe for everybody, but I think in refugee responses, in all the things that we can do to try and help, it's disability inclusive responses are important. And I know that's something that Gerard Quinn, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, is pushing very hard. Thank you, Ehsan, for bringing us to that. Yeah. I suspect, like many of you, I've been finding it difficult to sleep the last few days, just looking at the news. Yeah, it's something that's at the forefront of all our hearts and minds.
Thank you for making this great effort to respond to this absolutely complex but a very important question by
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm being asked to ask, even though I said the last question was the last question, but there's another one that we just need to ask. This is from Natalisa Charles. Thank you for that wonderful presentation, Ms. Lawson. I know that there are people who do not accept the difference between themselves and people with disabilities. That is why they make destructive criticisms of these people. Now, I would like to know how you overcame the criticism that are directed at you so that they don't get to you. Where did you find motivation to continue despite this?
Thank you. Gosh, I'd love to hear what people in the call have to say on all of these questions as well, because I'm sure they would be fascinating responses. But thank you, Natalisa. So I think that's a really perceptive comment, and I know that for me, I find it much easier to speak on behalf of other people than I do on behalf of myself. I can find much greater depth of anger and power and resilience when I feel I'm speaking for others rather than if it's just for myself. And I think feeling part of a movement has been really, that's been one of the helpful things about that it allows you to feel that you're part of a collective. And if somebody criticizes something that's disability related, I think that's not just me. That's, that could go to those people. It's really important that that I put across the perspective that I can to try and do what I can to reduce tensions, divisions, and just grow support for disability inclusion, disability rights all over the world.
Yeah. Thank you, Anna. I'm just checking if we have any more questions. Okay, so I will keep my promise. That question, the last question, was really the last one. And I know that some of our students will have to run to another class in 4 minutes. But I'd like to say that, with confidence, that we should be proud of ourselves, and our inaugural lecture was really a success. And the credit, of course, goes to you, Anna. Thank you for being so personal and so sharing and generous with us, with the knowledge, with the expertise that you have. I think you inspired us, well, definitely myself, to reflect more on how we should be talking about, how we should be educating, and how should we be doing our research with the idea of disability issues in mind.
Thank you, Elena, and thank you all for those really wonderful questions. And yeah, it's just been great to be part of this event. So thank you so much, and I really hope to connect with you again. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, yes. I'd like to join you in thanking the our colleagues for organizing it, and our participants for being with us and asking their questions. I'm sure there are more questions, and there will be this inaugural lecture was recorded, so it will be made available very soon for people who would like to revisit and think through the questions that you raised, and the kind of wisdoms that you shared with us. So I'd like to invite all of us to our next event, which will happen in the end of April, and this is going to be a panel discussion on disability issues in March. Oh, sorry, in April. I said in April. Yeah. Erin, would you like to? Is there anything else that I'm forgetting to mention, or Caitlin?
No, I just want to thank Anna for a wonderful lecture and question and answer period. We really appreciate your wisdom and all that you brought to us today. And Elena, thank you so much for being a brilliant moderator and guiding us through. And I just want to thank the Disability Justice Working Group from OSUN, and for Caitlin and Rose for all of the back-end support. And thank you to the classes that joined us today. And we look forward to digging deeper as a network. But just thank you, everybody. Thank you, Anna, especially. It's wonderful.
Anna, you're also getting some things in the chat as well.
Oh,
All that out.
Thank you so very much.
All right, everybody, have a good rest of the day. Get to class.
Bye.